One of the most relevant issues for students across the country is education policy, particularly at the state level. How are states spending money? What are their priorities in education? And where are future investments going to be? Well, we sat down with education policy analyst Kaitlyn Shepard from the John Locke Foundation to discuss these very issues. We hope you enjoy the conversation.
And we'll turn it over to them to introduce themselves and get started. We'll take questions at the end as well, so if you have any questions.
Oh, thank you. Hi. Well, I don't think I really need to introduce myself because I think I've taught most of you here. But I am Miss Nix. If you have not had me, I'm the AP Government teacher and AP US History teacher. So maybe in your 10th or 11th grade year, you'll be in my class. I'll go ahead and let Kaitlyn introduce herself and tell us a little bit about her journey on how she became the education analyst that she is.
Well, hello, everybody. Thanks so much for having me. My name is Kaitlyn Shepard. I am the Education Policy Analyst with the John Locke Foundation, and we're a nonpartisan nonprofit, and we're dedicated to the ideas of John Locke that influenced the Founding Fathers, things like free markets, limited government, because we believe that these ideas are what enable families and North Carolinians to thrive. And so within that, we have a couple of different centers dedicated to different types of policy issues. So we have one center that's dedicated to agriculture and energy policy, one that's dedicated to election integrity, things like that. And so I'm part of the Center for Effective Education, and so a few of us work on education issues. And so specifically K-12, so it's good to be here with you all today. We do a lot of research and writing about the education system and ways that we can make it work better for the people that it's meant to serve, which is students and families. So excited to be here and looking forward to the discussion.
Could you tell us a little bit about some of your experience in working in education policy? So some of the things that you really enjoy doing, or some things that you specifically or individually find really challenging.
So I have been doing this for about 3.5 years now. I've been doing it for 2 years here with the John Locke Foundation, and then about 1.5 years before that in Idaho, working on similar issues. And so kind of what I do on a day-to-day basis is I do a lot of research and writing about problems in our education system and write about ways that we can improve it and make it work better for students. And so it's very exciting. It's much broader of an issue than a topic area than I initially thought. When I became an education policy analyst, I thought I was going to be working mostly on school choice issues, but as I've been in it a while, I've learned that it's involves a lot of other topics other than just school choice. We deal a lot with accountability. So how are we ensuring that we're getting results for the money that we're spending on education here in our state? We do a lot of just various work with content standards. How are we making sure that the standards that we have across our state, ensuring that everyone is getting a uniform education? How are we making sure that those are conveying the skills and the knowledge that students need to be successful, no matter what you go on to do, if you go on to post-secondary education, if you go on to the workforce, whatever you want to do after graduating from high school, we want you to be successful. So we want to make sure we have strong standards that can help with that. So it can be a bit of a challenge having to juggle so many different topic areas. I feel like every day is a different research problem that I'm tackling, and so it can be kind of hard bouncing around between all of those, but it's definitely interesting, and it's not what I expected. It's much more broader than I expected when I started out.
So you've covered a lot of the more generalized challenges that education analysts face, but what are some of those challenges that you think are more specific to North Carolina? And could you elaborate on a couple of those challenges that education in North Carolina is facing currently?
So I think there are a lot of things that I could talk about, but one of the things that I see kind of percolating right now that's a challenge for North Carolina has to do with school finance. So I've been doing a lot of research about this recently into how are we funding schools in our state? How much money are we spending on education? Is that money getting to where it needs to go? Are we getting the results that we need for the amount of money that we're putting in? And a lot of states around the country are moving to a different kind of school finance model than what we have here. and that's called student-based funding. So the basics of it is every student who attends school in that state gets a base amount of funding, let's say $6,000 or $7,000, but it depends on the state. So every student gets a base amount. And then if the student has above average needs, there will be additional money that is generated by that student for their education. So it depends on the state, but it can be things like being an English language learner, being in a career technical education track, being a gifted and talented student, things like that. So if you have above average needs, these states are providing additional money to help fund the costs of your education. And so there are a lot of advantages to this kind of a system. It's very simple and easy to understand. It's based on the needs of the students that are being served in that particular school district. It's transparent. It's easier for not only like school finance officers and legislators, but also students and families to understand where the money is coming from and where it's going. Tied with that is accountability. If you know how much money your school district is receiving and where that money is going, then if you're not happy with the results that you're seeing at your school, it's easier to bring that out to your principal, your school board leaders, about the concerns that you have with that. So there are a lot of advantages to that kind of a system. In North Carolina, we do things very differently, and we're one of a few states that still is doing it this way. We kind of have a hybrid model that's focused on programs and resources. So instead of looking at school finance from the lens of what are the needs of the students that you are serving at your school or your district, we're looking at what the state thinks, the programs and inputs that the state thinks you need for an education. So there will be a pot of money to pay for teachers. There will be a pot of money to pay for instructional materials or driver's ed, things like that. So regardless of whether or not you need that at your district, you may need more money in a different area than you were given. There are a lot of restrictions on how you can move money around and how you can use it. And so that not only is just a lot more confusing for school finance officers and people who are trying to implement that, but also just for the average person to understand. And it complicates a lot of things. And in education, we want to have a system where we understand how much we're spending and the results that we're getting for that spending. So, and there have been a lot of reports over the past decade, 15 years that have kind of pointed out some of the problems with this system. And so it's a challenge I think that we're facing in education is how are we getting money to schools for education, and is that generating the outcomes that we want? Because at the end of the day, the money is for educating students and preparing students for success, and so we want to make sure that we're addressing that challenge.
With a new legislative term starting in North Carolina, what types of changes do you think we'll see in education being talked about on the legislative floor, and will any of those address the problem that you just talked about?
So here in North Carolina, our legislature works on a biennium. So in the odd numbered years, so 2025, we have the long session, and it's typically longer in length, so it lasts longer. But also one of the main challenges they address is passing a budget for the state. So they'll talk about the budget in the state, and that'll be for the next 2 years. And then in the short session, which is the even numbered years, not only does it last not as long, but they typically consider a lot of less types of bills can be considered. So they'll adjust the budget, but they won't necessarily make big, huge policy changes. So I think that's important to understand before we can talk about what is going through the legislature this session in the long session. So they are working on budget right now. That's kind of their main consideration. I think also a concern for them this session is providing recovery aid due to the horrible events that hit the western part of our state for Hurricane Helene. And that's taken up a lot of energy and their time and focus. So between those two things, I don't see a lot of movement on school finance at the legislature this session. I think among education advocates and people that are concerned with kind of generating ideas about how to make education better, like people like myself, there's been some interest in that, kind of in advocates, but not as much right now at the legislature just because of Helene efforts and the budget taking up a lot of their time and attention. One thing I do see going through this session that might be of interest to you all is a bill that would deal with the use of cell phones in school. This is something we've seen in a lot of other states recently, and it's gaining traction here as well. There's been a bill introduced in both the House and the Senate, not exactly the same, but pretty similar, that would look to have every school district adopt a policy with your school board to ban the use of phones in class during class time. I think there's been a lot of concern in recent years about the effect that cell phones can have on mental health, on bullying issues, stuff like that. In addition, distracting from the instruction in class time. And so I think that's something that lawmakers are looking to address that seems to be, given that there's a bill in both the House and the Senate, seems to be gaining a little bit of traction, kind of riding the coattails of other states that have passed reforms on that issue.
Are there any other bipartisan initiatives that you think will make any sort of progress in upcoming legislation, either at the North Carolina level or any other states that you're looking and researching into, or maybe even at the federal level?
Well, kind of like I alluded to earlier, I think a lot of the attention has been taken up by hurricane relief. And so it seems to be that a little bit different from past sessions, in that there doesn't seem to be as much interest in taking up kind of some of these large policy proposals that we've seen, like with school choice in 2023. That was a big issue that took up a lot of the conversation around education. But I don't see there being a lot of large kind of things like that and bipartisan things that might go through this session just because of their kind of the things competing for their attention with the hurricane relief. But I don't see why something like a cell phone bill would not gain traction on both sides of the aisle. I think the research has been pretty clear on the detrimental effects of having phones in class time, and so I think that's something that I could see them gaining some consensus around that kind of an idea.
Outside of the school finance issue that you've been working on a lot, are there other more recent things that the John Locke Foundation is focusing on with education policy in North Carolina?
So school finance has been one of our major research efforts lately, but another thing that we're interested in looking into is the idea of school choice. So not only in North Carolina do we have 2 school choice programs that help kids choose private schools if that's what they feel, if their family feels is the best fit for them. We have 2 programs here that help families to do that. But choice is also a lot more broad than that. So here we have charter schools, which are like public schools, but they have more flexibility in certain administrative things like hiring decisions and some curriculum matters. Just they'll have a little bit more flexibility, but they're still considered public schools. And so even charter schools are facing some challenges with operations, specifically around zoning issues, getting buildings for their students and their classrooms. They don't have the same access to funds for that sort of a thing. And so that's a challenge with choice implementation. One thing that I've been looking into is the idea of public school choice. So here in North Carolina, we do not have a policy at the state level that would let you choose a different public school if you attend a public school, but you want to attend one other than the one that you're assigned to in your school district. If you wanted to go to a different district, we don't have a policy at the state level that would make those choices universal across the state. There are a couple districts that have their own policies on that, but most students, about 75% of students in North Carolina, still attend public schools. And so I think it's also important for those students to be able to choose the school that works best for them. That may be the one that you're assigned to based on where you live, but it may not be. And so I think that's one thing that I have been researching is how do we make a policy like that what would that look like for North Carolina, and how can we not only expand access to private schools and charter schools, homeschools, but also in the public schools as well.
I think you actually provided a perfect segue because we are a charter school. And so it might be really interesting to hear your perspective, like elaborating a little bit more on those obstacles that specifically charter schools face in getting a lot of the things done that maybe a larger district would be able to do maybe simpler. Are there anything else that you could elaborate on for that?
Well, one thing that I've picked up on in the course of reading about school finance is a lot of finance issues that charters are facing. So charter schools are not allowed to use a certain pot of money for things like getting land and getting additional buildings and classrooms and stuff like that public district schools can do. And so the way that our school finance system is treating both of these types of public schools is not the same. And so that's creating challenges for charter schools, which are serving a significant percentage of students in the state and making that option available for families. And so that's one area where the school finance system is not treating these two types of schools equally and making it harder for charter schools to that may be very successful, maybe want to expand, buy a new building, kind of holding them back from being able to serve additional students.
What do you think would need to be changed to fix that system? Like, who put that system in place and how could that be rectified?
It would definitely have to be a change made at the legislative level. There's some laws that are standing in place of charter schools being able to have equal access to money. I think revising our school finance system and moving to more of a weighted student system that gives charter schools would give district and charter schools more flexibility to use the money in the way that they see fit would definitely help. So that would be one thing that I would think of offhand.
Awesome. Are there any other changes that you think beyond the school finance system, which I think you've elaborated beautifully on, that could benefit North Carolina specifically? That and the phones, I think. Anything beyond this?
There are a lot of bills going through, so I want to make sure I don't miss any. I think one area that I think is gaining a little traction this year as well is seems to be anyway is dealing with the school calendar. So under our state law, school districts are not allowed to start the school year before a certain time or end before a certain time. And so school districts want to have more flexibility around that so that they can have exams before the holidays instead of having to come back and finish them after. When you've had a significant vacation, maybe you've had some learning loss during that time. So districts are kind of wanting to have more flexibility around that. But on the other side of the issue, we have tourism concerns where a lot of businesses in the beach areas and the mountainous areas rely on maybe students for their workforce. And so they want to have a defined summer period where they can expect to have workers for their business. And so they don't want schools to go back to session earlier. And so there's kind of those tension between those competing interests. And there's been a lot of bills that would affect individual school districts introduced. And there have been a couple that would change the policy for the whole state. And so I think that's something that is interesting. I'm not sure if they will really see any action. It seems like it's one of those issues that keeps coming back and never is really resolved, but it's one thing I've seen kind of going through the legislature. Another thing, interesting bill that I've seen has to do with sports participation. So there's a bill that would allow private school students, homeschool students, charter students as well, to participate in an extracurricular activity or a sports team at their district public school, high school next to them, if their school doesn't offer that opportunity. And so it's looking to expand opportunities to students that may not have that. It would allow that school district taking that student to charge a fee for participation. So they would have to pay for the privilege of doing that extracurricular, but they would have access to more opportunities than they normally would do. So that's one thing that's been introduced this session that may see some action. So I think that's an interesting one to kind of look to involve more choices around sports and extracurriculars. So that's one that's really caught my interest this session as well.
Awesome. I think that concludes the questions that we have. Yeah.
Alrighty, if anyone has a question, we'll bring you the microphone. It's very simple.
Hi, you were talking earlier about the school finance. How would you, what's the process between like you finding the research for that and bringing it up to the legislature?
That's a really good question. So I kind of see my role as being an idea generation machine and finding that research. And so we do a lot of reports and that are available on our website. And I am not personally down at the legislature myself very much, but we do have a lobbyist that brings our concerns to lawmakers that are interested in hearing about our ideas. We do also can do public comment if there's a bill that we're interested in that we can present and provide testimony on that bill. And we do presentations and events. Not long ago, we did have one on school finance. So we had some lawmakers in attendance that were interested in hearing about that issue. And so it was able to kind of present some of that research and just put those ideas out for anyone that's interested in them.
In your career, what kind of unexpected events to a bill passing have you seen? Has there been any secondary effects which you hadn't foreseen to the passing of the bill?
So I'm thinking back to my time when I was in Idaho, and we had some bills that were going through the legislature that we were watching. And one thing I didn't realize is how much power legislative leaders can have over the process. So there was a lot of power that the legislative leaders had on certain committees that they could kind of decide that they didn't want a bill to come up for a hearing or they didn't want it to come before the committee for consideration. So they were able to kind of keep ideas that they didn't want to be going through the legislative process to kind of be held up in the process. And so that was something that was surprising to me, was just how much there can be certain people to be holding up the process when a bill is going through the system. So that was one thing that surprised me and held up certain policies.
August, please.
So you said y'all are a nonpartisan organization, but you have senators that you directly work with. How do you kind of do they run on the John Locke campaign, or do they run on a specific party campaign? How does that all kind of function?
So we are nonpartisan, and we're a C3, so we don't participate in any campaigning or anything like that. We don't endorse or oppose any candidates. But if lawmakers reach out to us about something that we've spoken about publicly or we've researched or put out on our website, we are able to answer their questions. And so sometimes they'll kind of approach us and ask questions about something that we've said. And so that's primarily how my interaction has been. I had a lawmaker reach out to me once wanting to know more about AI in the classroom and how he could deal with some. I'm sure that's a challenge that maybe you guys have faced. He was wanting to know more about how he could, whether he should do anything about that or what he could do, what other states have been doing. And so I was able to kind of research and provide that information to him to help answer his question.
Lastly, just real quick, what is your opinion on businesses not wanting schools to expand the school year because of their job opportunities during the summer? Like, you kind of briefly went over it. I just wanted to know more about your opinion or maybe like a few arguments that you would have against that or for it?
So you want to know more about the school calendar issue and like
The tourist businesses in the east and the west.
side of it. Yeah. So I can see both sides of the issue. I think it's harder for us here to understand because it's not as much of a workforce issue. It's not our businesses here are not as seasonally driven as things on the beach are or things in the mountains when people are have time off and they are able to travel more. So I see where these businesses are coming from. Personally, I think that I would like to see the school districts have more flexibility to address it on their local level if they feel that they would like to start earlier so that they can get exams done. I think it, in my opinion, it should be up to the individual district. But I can see both sides. So,
Hugh, getting your steps in.
What sort of reforms does the John Locke Foundation want to see in North Carolina's education system?
so I think I already talked school finance to death. So I won't talk any more about that. But another thing that I think we would like to see generally is more transparency and accountability in the education system. So as a researcher, the way that the state collects certain data can be very hard to find what I'm looking for, find the numbers that I need to evaluate some of these policy areas. So it would be really good if we could have more transparency around our education data. How are we collecting that data? How is it, where can we find it? I think that would go a long way in helping things like that. Related to that is accountability. So we would support policies that introduce more accountability into the system. So for decades, we have seen more and more spending being put into education, but we've seen test scores around the state that are kind of stagnant or even declining. And so really the purpose of education and the money that we're spending on education is to help student outcomes. And it doesn't seem that there is a lot of correlation between those two all the time. We're not seeing the results that we would want for that spending, and not a whole lot is changing. And so we would support policies that kind of introduce more accountability into that system so that we're getting the results that we're looking for that spending.
I have a follow-up question to that, actually, before Sebastian goes. Thank you. What sorts of data would the John Locke Foundation find helpful in determining a successful educational outcome for schools? What sorts of, like, if accessibility to that data is already very hard, like what sorts of data would the John Locke Foundation like to see in order to determine that our education system is or is not successful?
Well, just what comes to mind is more challenges around accessing the data than maybe it not necessarily being available. So one thing is just I've noticed that there's not consistency in some of the state reporting. So I was looking at end of grade test scores the other day, and I would look at one report that would report a certain percentage, and the next report would have a slightly different percentage. And it wasn't that much different, but it does make a difference to have that be accurate and have the right numbers. And so that was a challenge for me. I think one thing that maybe would be easier is dealing with data that is available from private and home schools. So the way that our state collects data, there's good data available on district schools and charter schools, but private schools and home schools are not required to report data. So if you were looking for the amount of students who are homeschooled in North Carolina, they can give you an estimate based on those who have reported, but it's not a hard and fast number. And so it's useful, but it's not the most useful. And so that's kind of, I just wish there would be more accessibility to some of that data just in the course of the work that I'm doing. So,
Sebastian.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on what you said also just now, which was like, I was homeschooled in my 7th and 8th grade year. We named the school after my favorite show and did not have to report nearly anything. So it is kind of that easy. But my first question was, you had mentioned earlier something about, I think it was homeschool and private school, maybe kids being able to access sports of their district school. And you also mentioned something that's like a little bit before that about being able to, if you want to switch schools from your district school, would those two things, like would that connection instantly be made where a homeschooler could do sports at this school and say, nope, I want to go to this one? Or would there have to be some kind of other intermediate bill passed that connects those two?
So I want to be sure I'm getting your questions. Do you want to know more about the bill to let students participate in sports at the high school? And then was the other one having to do with attending whatever public school you want to attend? Is
there a confliction with being able to attend what public school you want and being able to do sports at what public school you want as a homeschooler?
I think those are two separate things. So the bill that's going through right now is just dealing with sports or extracurriculars. So if you are a homeschool student and your homeschool pond doesn't offer lacrosse, but the high school in your area does, you would be able to apply to participate in that lacrosse team. But it wouldn't deal with like school attendance as much. It would be two separate things. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. Oh wait. Well, I don't know. I'm gonna give it to Carissa.
Personally, what do you which bit of research did you find the most impactful for creating a successful school in North Carolina?
Reaching for it.
I'm mentally running through all the things that I've looked at in the past. Most impactful for creating. Do you mean most impactful just generally on the education space, or more most impactful on, you want to know specifically about like creating or starting schools?
More so, what did you think improved the school system here the most?
I mean, the topic that I've spent the most on is school finance, and I think we have seen some movement. So among various groups. So it's our group. There's a lot of groups that are dedicated to public schools specifically have started talking about this issue, and so I think the report has kind of generated conversation around that. And reforming school finance is something that is a very big lift. It happens once every 30 or 40 years in most states. And so it's not something that's going to happen overnight. And so kind of starting the conversation on that and getting people from various coalitions involved and interested in talking about it and getting them to the table, I think has been something that I've been proud to kind of see being a small part of that and getting that conversation going. Because I think if there's a lot of interest among people like myself in that topic and reforming it, if people see the need to do that, then I think it catches lawmakers' attention. So it may not be this year that they're going to take action on it, but maybe if the conversation is happening in the community and they're hearing from district superintendents and others about how this system is affecting them and how moving to student-based funding would work better for North Carolina, I think that's something that would be impactful. Just we haven't quite seen it at the legislature yet.
Carissa also.
Hi, thank you for coming in today. You mentioned, or I suppose, I'm curious on how you landed yourself at this position. You mentioned about working in Idaho. Would you say like your high school or college experience was needed for that, or were you like, did you know from the beginning you want yourself in this position where you can impact the education system?
So I kind of had a roundabout way of getting to where I am. My favorite class in high school was history and civics. I just thought it was very interesting learning about how our government system functions and different branches and how they interact with each other. So that was something I'd always been interested in. So I kind of knew that I wanted to do writing. I thought I would pick a different policy area, but what kind of got me started on education was a paper that I had to write for higher ed. And in the course of trying to decide what I was going to write about, talking with my mentor about it, and we kind of talked about um, my experience. And I attended a classical Christian K-12 school all the way through. And in the summers, to make money for college, I worked at a local public school. They had an after school and summer program for students in the community. And so I felt that the education that I received was very academically rigorous. It set me up for success academically. And I saw a contrast with where some of my students in that public school program were. I had some students that were had finished fifth grade, about to go into sixth grade, and were not where they needed to be with their reading level. And so I kind of saw the contrast between the academic rigor that I had and what some of my students had experienced in their educational career, and realized how important it is to have access to the educational environment that's best for you. It may be a public school, it may be a private school like mine was, maybe homeschooling, but just wanting to not only provide more opportunities for students like what I had, but also to make all the different types of schools better for the students that choose those other options. So that was kind of how I got there. I didn't start out thinking I was going to go into education policy specifically, but realized that it was something that not only did I just really care about personally, but saw the importance of it to students, and that was what kind of brought me into education policy specifically.
How does transportation fit into the school choice thing? Because I know a lot of kids can't get themselves to school, much less a school that would be further away. And the legislature seems very uninterested in hiring more bus drivers.
That's a really good question. I'm not as familiar with how the transportation works as I would like to be, but I do know that it is a challenge. And with something like public school choice, if North Carolina were going to offer more options within the public school districts, I know that a lot of states that have done that have a provision in their law where the family would provide transportation, so it wouldn't be provided by the school district. But yeah, that is a big challenge. That would kind of limit opportunities for students to be able to have access to choices, even if they're offered.
Hello.
Hi.
I know that COVID-19 funding has ended. From what I have seen, there's at least half of the grade level of learning loss in North Carolina. And I don't know of any legislation that has passed that has tried to, try to combat that or try to help that. It's just like we came back to school like nothing happened. But the learning loss happened. And I'm curious if there are still any conversations about COVID-19 learning loss and how we can kind of help with that. I'm just curious if that's still in the conversation because it's still a big issue, coupled with phones.
Yeah, you're exactly right. There has been a huge learning loss that we're now seeing as we're getting more years of testing data after pandemic closures coming in. It's been a huge drop. And so that's something that's very concerning. I think part of that is not necessarily how much money was received for COVID, but how that money was spent. So there were several $billions worth of COVID funding that came into North Carolina from the federal government. So there was a big influx of federal funding, but most school districts spent that on things like teacher salaries and bonuses, kind of these recurring expenses. You have to pay for your teachers every year, so they decided to provide bonuses and salary supplements one time for those teachers instead of spending the money on learning loss. And I can't recall the exact percentage, but you can find it that shows how much money was spent on tutoring, which has been shown in the research to be one of the more effective ways of dealing with learning loss is to have high dosage one-on-one tutoring with the students that need that extra assist from closures. And so unfortunately, there wasn't much of that money that was spent on tutoring, which I think would have been a more effective use of that money. I understand the pressures that districts were under, but I think that it would have been more effective to use that money for tutoring. And so I'm just disappointing that that wasn't used in something that could have been more effective in addressing that learning loss. So I think we're having to kind of deal with some of the fallout of that. So.
Holden.
Probably our last two questions. We're gonna kill some time.
So you mentioned AI earlier, and I think it's become a rising issue in schools. So as it continues to develop, where do you see this issue headed? Like, can anything be done? Will anything be done in the future as it continues to advance?
So in North Carolina, states have taken different ways of addressing this. So in North Carolina, instead of kind of passing a law regulating this at the state level, we haven't seen anything like that. But the Department of Public Instruction has kind of guidelines that they've put out on like what they consider to be best practices around the use of AI and kind of encouraging school districts to have a policy on that. I think as AI becomes more prevalent, I have been known to use it in the course of my work. So I think it is a tool that can be helpful, but I think it's best for school districts to have their own policy about the use of AI because I know in education there are a lot of concerns about academic integrity around the use of AI. We want people to know when it's acceptable to use that for your assignments and when it's not acceptable. So I don't know offhand how many school districts have adopted a policy like that, but I think as it becomes more and more mainstream and the uses of it continue to grow, I think it would be wise for districts and schools to have their own policy so that everyone knows what are acceptable uses and what are not.
I was curious as to how the school choice policy, like how that would affect maybe like school space. Like I imagine if some person who's maybe further from the school wants to go to a school that someone else is closer to, how would that affect? Like if that person who's closer can't get into the school, like would that complicate like competition in schools and stuff?
So I know in a lot of states that have adopted choice among public schools in their law, there's a provision that provides kind of priority for students that live within that district. Because like you're saying, it would be if you were zoned for that school district and that was the one that you wanted to attend, it would be very inconvenient if a student from across the state was come in and took your spot, so that would be very disruptive to the education system, which is not what we want. We want to make it work better and have more options for students. So a lot of states have dealt with it that way by kind of prioritizing students that already live within that geographic boundary. And then if there's additional spaces available, offering those up to students from outside the district.
I think we are closing in on time here. So, you want to go out? Okay.
Can we just give a round of applause for our guests? Thank you so much.
A big thanks to both Kaitlyn Shepard and Shana Nix for giving us just a little bit of their time for this important conversation. The podcast is directed by Spencer Bluth. Our producer is Stanley Tirtara Harja. Our photographer is Kyle Sunquist. Our event manager is Colton Hankins. Our social media manager is Zain Abdulbeki. Our club sponsor is Elizabeth Godwin.